I believe our job is to be the most useful person in the room. And I think being useful and helping to solve people's clients' problems, or helping to help creatives get to the best work, or helping agencies thrive, is about being useful.
Hi, I'm Neil Perkin, and welcome to Think with Google Firestarters. So Firestarters is a series of insightful conversations with the interested and the interesting of the advertising and communications industry. And today I'm lucky enough to be speaking to Gen Kobayashi. So Gen is the Chief Strategy Officer UK EMEA at Weber Shandwick, the international PR and comms agency. Before joining Weber Shandwick, he was the CSO at Engine, and he's also been the head of strategy at Ogilvy. So Gen, welcome to Firestarters. So I'm going to dive straight in, if I may, and just ask, what is your provocation for the Firestarters audience?
Thanks, Neil. It's great to be here. So my provocation for this conversation is, are PR people really from Mars and ad people really from Venus?
Great, that's a really good starting point, I think. So, bearing in mind you move from advertising into Weber Shandwick, so I'd just like to dive obviously into that in a bit more detail. So it sounds like what you're saying is that there are differences, but also perhaps a lot of similarities between the PR world and advertising and comms. So, talk me through what you mean by that.
I mean, I've spent the majority of my career over the last sort of 22, 23 years working in ad agencies. I joined Weber Shandwick 2 years ago. So I'm still relatively new in the world of a pure play PR and comms agency, if you like. But I had a lot of misconceptions maybe, and a lot of kind of assumptions I used to make about PR people versus ad people. And I would argue that we aren't as different as you may think. And the industry, whilst the two industries are obviously, kind of very, very adjacent, there are some differences, but I would argue there's probably more in common between ad people and PR people than there are things that divide them.
I guess both sides of that is quite interesting to dive into, actually, because it'd be interesting to identify what the similarities are and why they're perhaps less different than people think, but also to actually think about what the differences are from the point of view of what you can learn, what advertising could learn from PR, for example, and maybe vice versa. So let's start with the similarities. So talk to me about how similar they are and where those kind of areas of similarity exist.
I think so. To start with, I think the similarity, one of the major similarities between the two disciplines is whether you're in advertising or whether you're in PR and communications, you're still in the business of people and human beings, and understanding what motivates people and human beings, what drives behavior, what drives intent, is still core to both disciplines. And good PR and effective PR and effective advertising should really be motivating people in some way. So I would say that's probably the core unifier that sort of that brings us together. Another core similarity that exists between the two fields, I would argue, not only is it about motivating humans and people, but I would argue culture sits firmly at the heart of both disciplines. And I would argue the best advertising practitioners and best ad agencies really understand culture in the same way that the best PR agencies that really understand culture. And actually culture really is a unifier when it comes to both disciplines. So I think, the two primary similarities are motivating people and really understanding culture. However, I do think there are nuances and differences between the two. I think some of the differences that certainly I've increasingly got closer to over the last couple of years working at Weber. I would say the first one being actually a level of pace and responsiveness. You know, I think the world of PR naturally is far more attuned to being responsive, being able to move quickly, being able to respond to culture, being able to respond to moments in time. I would argue advertising is probably less set up in that way. It's probably a bit more structured. It's probably slightly more deliberate and slightly longer term based sort of approaches. The other difference, I would argue, and actually what makes the PR and comms world fascinating to work in and something that I really enjoy is I think the world of advertising has probably far more codification to it and a far longer sort of, I suppose, there's a lot of academia that exists in the world of sort of brand building within advertising. You know, dozens of books have been written. There's marketing science attached to it. There's models of behavior that we all know about. Academics like the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, as well as, you know, the likes of Byron Sharp have been writing about how brands operate in relation to advertising for a long time. I would argue the world of PR is slightly less codified in that sense, and actually slightly harder to define in that sense, in the same way that that advertising has had historically that kind of structure around it. And as I said, fleet of foot and being able to respond in a far quicker way is really core to PR. So that sort of pace is slightly different, I would say.
I think there's quite a bit to dive into there. So it's interesting what you were saying there about the kind of level of pace and responsiveness as being perhaps a key area of difference. So do you think that is down to perhaps process? I mean, you mentioned sort of advertising more codified, and you know, there is an ad process, and typically it's a kind of sequential process. So PR, though, may be more responsive because you're trying to act on things which are in the moment, perhaps a bit more, as well as that kind of fundamental kind of basis for what you're doing. So tell me a bit about the PR kind of process, as it were, and how you're able to kind of act quicker and capitalize on those kind of short-term cultural moments, perhaps.
Yeah, I would argue it's a slightly, so in terms of from a process perspective, I would argue the key difference is your default setting. And I would say, you know, the world of advertising, the default setting tends to be, what is it that the brand that I'm working for, or the client, on behalf of the client that I'm working for, what is it the brand that wants to communicate to its audience? And obviously I'm overly simplifying things here, but from a PR perspective, the default is less about what is the brand going to want to communicate. It's more about what is it that people in the real world will actually care about? What is it that the news cycle will pick up on? What is it that journalists will want to write about? What is it that people in the street will want to talk about? So it's less, the starting point is just, I would say, slightly different, and the default setting is less brand first and probably more culture first and people first and conversation first. And I think that is a slight, whilst, you know, it is a slight, it's a slight difference, I would say that is still quite a fundamental change to your process and your way of thinking.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of framing it, I think. And I mean, fundamentally, as you were saying, both advertising and PR are about changing perception, I guess, in perhaps sort of slightly different ways, but you know, changing perception fundamentally. But PR takes a different approach to doing that, and you're thinking there about you know, how the brand comes across in terms of media coverage, and you know, what people see perhaps and less obviously in terms of commercial kind of aspects of that. So what do you think it is perhaps that advertising could learn from PR about how PR changes perception?
My previous roles, when working in kind of more traditional ad agencies, if you like, I've always loved working with PR practitioners in that world, because they had the innate ability to cut through, and excuse the language, cut through the bullshit. because they saw ideas through the lens, as I said, through that earned first lens. So less about necessarily any internal agendas. It's less about what the marketing team would like to put out there, or less about what the creative director would like to put out into the world, and more about what will actually be picked up and really talked about in the real world. And I think that level of pragmatism, but also deep understanding of the real world and understanding of culture really is hugely valuable in the process. And I would argue, as I said, generally at the very beginning, the best ad agencies operate like that anyway, and they have that innate ability to really understand what will get talked about in the real world. But I think yeah, PR practitioners have that, as I said, brilliant ability to kind of really take that pragmatic approach and really cut through what is it that's going to get talked about in the world, and what is it that's going to get picked up by the news cycle. And that start point, I think, is it's a much harder start point, because, as I said, it's less in your control, it's less codified, and it's less within the brand guidelines of your clients, if you like. It's more about you have to operate within the sort of messy and the complex. Our global chief creative officer, actually, Tom Beckman, talks a lot about that, which is, you have to have the ability to operate less in the zoo and more in the jungle, if you like. And it's harder because, as I said, it's less protected and less codified.
Yeah, I love that analogy. And so what do you think that means for strategy, for being a strategist? I can see there's lots of similarities here, both rooted in the brand strategy, of course, but what you're saying there is your starting point is perhaps slightly different, because you're thinking about operating in the jungle rather than the zoo, as you put it. So what does that mean in terms of your approach to creating a strategy for the brand?
I think, as I said, it's about doing due diligence. I think, as any decent strategy or a decent strategist would say, whether you work in an ad agency, a media agency, a PR agency, or an activation agency, is starting with a credible insight, a credible truth, a real deep understanding of the audience you're trying to engage with. I know that's a really obvious thing to say, but obviously I think all strategies start there, and really having a clear idea of what are the headwinds and what are the tailwinds that exist around the opportunity space you're looking to enter. And we talk about at Weber, really finding that clear opportunity space for us to help a client make a move into, and that is primarily about finding what are the conversations that you can either join, that's a tailwind, or generate from scratch, which is a bit more of a headwind, but you can either choose to join or generate a conversation. And I think that's for me, that's a credible starting point from an earned first lens, to take an earned first approach to communications, which is, when I talk about earned, I don't necessarily mean earned media. I don't mean that in pure media sense. I mean earned as in a mindset. It's an earned first mindset, and really understanding how can you help this brand earn their way into people's hearts and minds, into conversations, into people's homes, rather than necessarily, relying on paid for advertising to do that for you.
It strikes me also that perhaps there is more flexibility, perhaps in PR, to with creative ideas, I suppose. The output doesn't have to be an ad, for example. As a strategist, therefore, does that mean that you need to know more about more stuff in the PR world?
I think as strategists, whether you're in the PR world or in the ad world, the best strategists tend to be pretty curious people and want to know more about everything anyway. So I don't necessarily think that that's any different in the world of PR. What I would say, though, within PR agencies and within the sort of earned world, often the impact of your work goes beyond marketing. So, for example, reputation is a really good example of that. Reputation management, which often is the job of a PR agency versus an ad agency. Reputation is driven by far more than just the marketing team. Obviously, reputation is everyone from the CEO of an organization through to the call center staff, through to how you manage your supply chain of an organization. That is a broader reputational challenge for any organization. Now, as a PR agency practitioner, working on a reputational brief like that, for example, as a strategist, you probably have to have a wider sense of understanding of an organization's challenges or kind of opportunities beyond the marketing sphere itself. So I'd argue maybe your aperture does have to be slightly wider, but I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, well, you have to become an expert. I'm not suggesting that PR strategists are experts on supply chain management, for example, but I'm saying that they probably have a wider scope of view, if you like, beyond the marketing sort of realm itself. So
just going back to that sort of point about culture, because I'm interested to know if you have any sort of tips for, as a kind of strategist, how you would keep in touch with culture and the kinds of things within culture and how culture's changing and the things that are creating opportunity, perhaps from a comms perspective. It's a lot to kind of keep track on and to think about. So what's the best way in which you can stay in touch with that kind of the cultural aspect?
I think the first is to appreciate how deeply powerful culture is, and I think often culture is seen as a word semiotically probably communicates things that could be considered quite soft and quite almost a nice to have. I'd argue even the way culture is sort of segmented in our news cycle probably reflects a bit of that cynicism, or reflects some of that sort of semiotic meaning. If you pick up a newspaper, if anyone still does read a real newspaper anymore, but if you pick up a Sunday newspaper, you'll often find the culture section sits right at the back of the newspaper, behind all the important stuff like world news and business. You'll find culture hidden away, but I'd argue culture is often misunderstood and I suppose taken lightly, certainly by organizations and certainly by government. You only have to look at the recent the drama that was released earlier this year on ITV, Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, which was obviously a huge cultural moment in time in the UK that not only had people fixed to their screens enjoying entertainment and culture, if you like, but also it had a much wider impact. It had an impact on policy almost immediately, whereby the government immediately started trying to shift laws and give some of these poor postmasters and postmistresses compensation that they quite rightly deserve. And I would argue it was culture that drove that. This has been a scandal that's been going on for years historically, but it took a piece of culture to really kind of ignite that conversation and drive fundamental policy change, which I think again is a really interesting example of the power of culture when it comes to behavior change. So I would argue, the first is really understanding and really kind of appreciating the power that culture has within society and certainly within marketing. But then to answer your question about what we can do about that, I think there's also the need to understand that interconnectedness. So we talk about at Weber, we talk a lot about operating at the intersections of culture, society, technology, and policy. And the reason why we talk about operating at those intersections is because we understand that they increasingly in today's society they are more interconnected than ever. And when something happens in culture, it doesn't always stay in culture. And I think understanding that is hugely valuable, and understanding the wiring that happens and the mechanisms that connect all four of those things together, I think is a useful place to start, and really getting your head around that is important, I think.
And I'd like to just build on that by just asking a bit about a piece of research which I read that you'd done with the IPA and their data bank. And one of the findings from that research was about sort of earned coverage, and how the maximum kind of ROI came from campaigns which were relatively long term. So actually had a minimum of 9 months, which is a long time, isn't it? So I guess the question would really be, how do you keep the conversation going and the kind of talkability and of a campaign like that going for that long?
It's a good question. So that research was, as you mentioned, it was carried out in partnership with the IPA and using the IPA data bank. And I think, as you said, longevity was one of the key themes that came out of that. And I think often when we think about earned impact, and again, that might be, semiotically kind of communicating, potentially people think of a moment in time. They think of, have you made a splash on the front page of Metro today, or have you got onto the BBC breakfast sofa this morning, and that's your earned impact and earned coverage. And whilst that is important, what this research really underlined was actually that on its own is that on its own can do a job, but if you can marry that with longevity and consistent earned coverage over a long period of time, that's where you can really unlock value and growth for your clients. And I think that does require singular focus. It requires investment, and it requires belief in a strategy. And I think that's the same. It's true of any marketing kind of communications. Is, if you're willing to invest in the long term and take a platform approach to your thinking, I think you're more likely to see returns. And that's equally true for advertising as it is for PR and communications.
So I guess there's a couple of different aspects to that. I'm thinking, as you were talking there about the brand, and I guess the brand positioning and partnerships. I mean, I'm thinking, I guess, about celebrity partnerships and so on, which naturally can sort of lead to longevity. But I guess it's also about brands that campaign, that have a sort of purpose-driven sort of aspect to what they do. So do you think that there are multiple ways of achieving that kind of longevity?
I think so, and I don't think it always has to be purpose in that sense. Off the top of my head, you can think of amazing brands and brilliant strategies like Specsavers and their Should Have Gone Specsavers platform, which has been consistently invested in for decades now, I believe. That's about single-mindedly owning that territory. And they were in the news, I think, earlier this week. They're in the news regularly. They were able to respond regularly to things that happen in the news cycle. I think that's a really, really smart example of a brand that understands that investment and understands the need for driving kind of consistent earned conversation and talkability around the brand. And that isn't necessarily a social purpose. That's just a very smart sort of brand strategy, I would say. But equally, you're right. Purpose can play that role, and you only have to look at the likes of Dove, for example, that have kind of consistently invested and was the early pioneers of purpose-led work, if you like, and they consistently have kind of put their money behind that and seen great dividends through their work. So to answer your question, I don't necessarily think it needs to be social purpose. It could equally be as I said, consistently investing in a sort of ownable, unique point of view for the brand.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess I'd like to just ask a bit about the role of influencer marketing, social media, and the changes that we've seen in social media with the rise of different platforms and various, different formats like video in particular, I guess. So how has that impacted the practice of PR, do you think?
The influence sector, if you like, within the industry is without doubt one of the fastest growing areas of the industry. It's a hugely valuable tool in any kind of toolbox, marketing toolbox, and I think you only have to look at, as I said, the investment that the brands are making in the world of influence to see how important it is. And I think, but I would say whilst the fundamentals are still there, as we talked about at the very beginning of the meeting, which is, how do you drive changes in perception, or how do you motivate human behavior? Those are still fundamental. The strategy sitting behind it is still fundamental in the world of influence, but I would argue the slight nuances, again, going back to my point of control versus, or zoo versus jungle, it is slightly the world of influence. You have to be prepared to take a slightly different mindset and be able to understand how to get the best and how to motivate influencers in the right way. And it's less about brand first, it's probably more of a joint partnership between the brand and the influencer, and kind of respecting each other in that sense and getting the best out of each other in that sense. So a slightly different mindset again.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I'd also like to just go back to something we were talking about earlier on about the kind of role of the strategist within PR. And we were talking earlier a bit about how you need to know a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff to kind of understand and capitalize on all the different plethora of opportunities. You did write a really interesting post quite a while ago now about, I think it was off the back of reading Chris Hadfield's book, An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. And you were talking about how he was saying the best astronauts are the ultimate polymaths, but he had this really interesting kind of idea, which he wrote about the three types of people: positives, neutrals, and negatives. And interestingly, you wrote about the need for planners to be neutrals rather than just automatically to be a positive. Could you tell us a bit more about that and why you think strategists or planners should really be neutrals?
Yeah, and so the reason why I think that it's a great book, and I think the reason that Chris Hadfield's story around positives, neutrals, and negatives is applicable to planning is, I think as planners, we are often I can't stand the sort of the stereotype of the old adage that the planner's job is to be the smartest person in the room, because I fundamentally disagree, but also I'm often not the smartest person in the room. I don't believe that's our job. I believe our job is to be the most useful person in the room. And I think being useful and helping to solve people's clients' problems, or helping to help creatives get to the best work, or helping agencies thrive, is about being useful first and foremost. And I think Chris Hadfield's point about positives, neutrals, and negatives is about reminding yourself that often the most useful thing you can do is not to jump in with assumptions. And so much of what we do in agency marketing world, whether you're in ad world or whether you're in PR world, timelines are never long enough. They're getting shorter each day. Budgets are getting smaller, timelines are getting shorter. There is often a temptation for us to jump in and try to solve problems, because that's what we're here to do, and we love solving problems. Let's be honest, that's what we're naturally sort of built to do. But I think the point on being a neutral is often you can jump in and try to be that positive and come up with the answers in the room when no one's got time. You're going to be the person that solves it. I'm going to do this. I'm going to help you. But you will often bring preconceptions to the table. You'll often bring assumptions. You'll bring your own unconscious bias. You'll bring your perspective, which can be useful, but often can be not particularly helpful if you're not willing to stop and listen. And I think the point being is often, I think to be the most useful person in the room, a planner has to be that neutral and be willing to hear other people's perspectives, listen to other people's opinions, and build on them. And I think that's equally a valid role for any planner. So it's more of a watch out. It's more of a sort of internal watch out for me, is try and hold back your temptation to be that person in the room that jumps in and tries to solve it without really thinking about what you're doing. And that's the difference between the positive and the neutral. Never be a negative though. No one wants that.
No, absolutely.
Don't be the problem spotter, but yeah. Try and take a neutral view.
Yeah, cool. I mean, I really like that whole idea, and because I think, you know, I think Chris Hadfield's version of a positive is you kind of just automatically trying to add value to everything that you can wherever possible. And what you're saying there is that actually there's real value for a planner and strategies is to observe and to listen and learn before you dive in. And I guess I think something else I saw you say in an APG piece, I think it was about simplification. I wonder if that process of just observing, listening, and then perhaps distilling and simplifying, and that's really a useful role that a planner and strategist can play. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, 100%. I think our clients' lives are complicated enough without agencies reflecting any complexity whatsoever. Our role should be, we should be helping to make our clients' lives easier. And I would argue planning and strategies role within that process is at the heart of it. And I think we're the engine room of simplicity, if you like. I think there's lots of, you only have to take a glance at a client brief to see there's a huge amount of complexity, huge amounts of information that's important to know. But what's really valuable is understanding how you can get to really asking the right questions to get to the real problem that you're trying to solve. And I think that does take, that requires hard work. It's hard to get to simple. It's not easy to get to simple. And I think the old, I think it was Mark Twain or someone like that, Mark Twain quote of, "I didn't have time to write you a short letter," I think is true for planning and strategy. It does take time, and simplicity isn't easy, but I think that's probably one of the most valuable commodities we can bring to the table as planners.
Brilliant. Love that. And that's a great note, I think, to wrap this up. Unfortunately, we've run out of time again, but really, really insightful. So thank you very much for your time again. And if you're watching or listening to this, don't forget to subscribe and to share the episode, of course. But my thanks to Gen for a brilliant episode and some wonderful insights. Thank you again.